Hi, everyone. Welcome to Metametrics webinar titled Has Reading Instruction Improved in 40 Years? We are really happy that you are joining us this afternoon. I am Sue Steinkamp, and I lead Metametrics research and development efforts, focusing on creating reliable frameworks and tools to support reading and math instruction. I've been in the assessment and measurement industry probably longer than I care to admit, but about 30 years, and primarily focusing on designing high-quality programs that advance educational outcomes. I would like to also introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Phil Capin and Dr. Nina Saha. Phil is a researcher and author of the article Reading Comprehension Instruction, Evaluating Our Progress Since Durkin's Seminal Study. Phil's research focuses on understanding differences in reading development and evaluating instructional practices, particularly for students with reading difficulties. He has led numerous federally funded projects and published in top academic journals. Phil is a former special ed teacher and is now dedicated to translating research into meaningful strategies for educators. And Nina, our other panelist, is a former special ed teacher turned literacy researcher, pardon me. Through her monthly reading research recap, she simplifies complex literacy studies for practitioners, bringing the gap between research and classroom, bridging the gap between research and classroom applications. She's passionate about empowering educators with actionable insights. So we are going to start today with a pop quiz. I know everybody's excited about that. Oops, sorry, you know what? I'm sorry. I forgot to talk about today's agenda. We're starting today with a pop quiz, and one lucky winner will win a prize, and it is a timed quiz, so speed matters. Then we're going to pass it off to Phil, and he's going to just provide an overview of his research and the paper. We'll have some discussion with our panelists, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So without further ado, our pop quiz. The quiz is going to pop up in just a minute, and like I said, you will have about 45 seconds to answer. So please answer quickly, and whoever submits the quiz the fastest with the most correct will win a prize, which will be announced at the end. Okay, it looks like the quiz has ended and the answers are popping up on your screen momentarily. And we'll also review the answers at the end when we reveal the winner. So thank you for your participation. And let's now turn it over to Phil to talk about his research.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this panel today. I'm excited to talk about this paper. I'd like to start by acknowledging the many people that contributed to the paper. You can see our co-authors there. And so this paper was focused on understanding typical reading instruction, particularly as it relates to reading comprehension instruction. And so we conducted a systematic review of observational research. And so let me sort of try to make sense of some of these words. So a systematic review is the idea is that we used a standard set of procedures to identify relevant articles and to extract information from those articles. And then it was reading observation research. So that means that we were looking at typically provided reading instruction. So this is naturally occurring instruction. We were not interested in instruction where researchers were testing a specific approach. So we want to see, what is the sort of character and nature of reading instruction, particularly as it relates to reading comprehension. And so you might wonder, that's sort of what we did. Why did we do this? And so the reason we were interested in this, it stems in part from a study that I conducted with colleagues in 2021, where we looked at fourth grade teachers' social studies instruction. We were really interested in understanding to what extent are teachers able to incorporate language and literacy practices within their social studies. And we know that progressive state standards call on teachers to not only develop content expertise, but also to support the students' ability to learn to read and to read to learn. And so that study, what we found is that teachers were incorporating more vocabulary than had been reported in prior studies. And they were also providing students more opportunities to engage with text and supporting text comprehension. But we also observed a pattern in which teachers were often reading the text aloud and then playing a really prominent role in the discussion. And so it made us think back to a paper from long ago, 1978-79. Dolores Durkin had published what became a seminal paper, like an important paper. And in that paper, she looked at English language arts instruction and social studies instruction in grades 3 through 6. And what she found is that or what she argued based on her findings, is that teachers were not supporting text comprehension as much as they were testing it. And so what she noticed is that oftentimes teachers would perhaps read a passage or ask students to read a passage, and then they would give students a handout or a worksheet with questions about the text. And she argued that worksheet is not really supporting or teaching them the processes involved with understanding text, but rather assessing their knowledge. And then she also talked about when you look at comprehension instruction and discussions, when they didn't provide worksheets, oftentimes they would just ask literal questions, right? And asking literal questions, I think, is important. But there's maybe richer ways to support reading comprehension. And so that's sort of the context for why we did this study. And so we conducted this study with the systematic review, and we looked at the research from Durkin's paper until now. And we were interested in, how much time are teachers spending on reading comprehension, and to what extent are the practices that is occurring in reading classrooms or in social studies in school settings, to what extent does it align with what is considered evidence-based practices? And we pulled the evidence-based practices from practice guides from the Institute of Education Sciences, which is part of the Department of Education, an important part of the Department of Education, in which they look at what works in research and generate findings that are really readily accessible to practitioners. And so if you don't know about that resource, you should look it up, the What Works Clearinghouse, and they have practice guides, and we use those to determine what evidence-based practices were. So it wasn't just like what I think, it was based on research. And I know we're going to talk about the findings, so I'll just say quickly, I think what we found is that studies published after 2000 had a higher incidence. Our findings suggest that there's more evidence-based practices being implemented after 2000 than prior to 2000, which I think is encouraging. However, we also saw that this pattern of interactions where a teacher reads a text and then maybe asks a literal question, which we now refer to as initiate, respond, and evaluate. And so this pattern is, you can imagine a teacher initiates a question, a student responds, and then the teacher evaluates their answer. So an example of this would be something like, what is the process by which plants make their food? There's a classroom of students, and then one student would say photosynthesis. And then the teacher say, yes, that's great, right? And so there we saw the same pattern. What Durkin argued as comprehension assessment, as opposed to comprehension supports, is still going on in many of the studies that were conducted. And so that's a brief summary. I know we're going to get into it, Sue. But that's the study that we did and some of the findings.
That's great. Thank you, Phil. That was a great overview. And I know this is just really critical research. Let's move into our panel discussion. So Nina, I'm going to throw the first question to you. What drew you to feature this study in your reading research recap, and why do you believe it's significant for educators today?
Yeah, thanks, Sue, for the question. So, just to back up a little bit, the Reading Research Recap is a monthly blog where I cover new reading research. And every month, I pick one paper that I do a deep dive or in depth discussion on in the blog. And I see about 10 to 15 different studies come through my email through various system alerts I have set up every day. So I'm always keeping like a lookout for that special study. And as soon as I saw this one, I knew it was going to be the one. So for a few reasons, the first was the span or scope of it. So this was zoomed out, very broad research over 4 decades, so 40 years, which if you're not familiar with research, this is pretty rare. Oftentimes it's, we know A, B, C, and D, and we're looking at this little part of E, to figure out these like nuances. But this kind of zoomed back, took a step back, and analyzed trends over time, which I loved. And then two other things that I think are really important for educators, why I think it's important for them and practitioners, is that the results were immediately implementable. So I always look for studies where that have results that you can change your practice tomorrow based on them. And a third thing is that it asks such an important question. Who doesn't want to know what's going on in terms of reading comprehension instruction in the classroom over the last 40 years? So it had this great question, not to say other research doesn't have great questions, but this one I knew a lot of educators would want to know about. So that's why I chose it to feature. And once we get into the results too, I think you'll see why it's way more important than some of the other research that I come across.
Well, that's a great segue. So, Phil, what are the most important takeaways from this study that you would like to share with teachers to impact their practice immediately?
Yeah. So I think a few important takeaways. I think one is that researchers who had conducted these observation studies reported that in many settings, teachers were spending or having students engage little time in reading comprehension. And one barrier to the amount of time teachers were spending on reading comprehension that was often cited in literature is that students were not given many opportunities to read, particularly read connected texts. And so Jade Wexler and Elizabeth Swanson and Sharon Vaughn have conducted studies in the secondary grades. There's also early elementary grade work, which shows that students don't have as much time as we would like actually engaging with text, particularly connected text. And so, the obvious issue there is that it's difficult to work on reading comprehension if students are not reading text. And so I think one finding is that maybe there's not enough time for students to engage in extensive text reading. And maybe it's not surprising in secondary grades that we see some of this because we know that some students have foundational reading difficulties and teachers report that their students are having difficulties reading the words off the page. And so I think some teachers, myself included, I taught in the middle grades, would sometimes circumvent the text knowing it was really difficult for kids. And so I think that's one takeaway is the limited time spent on reading comprehension and engaging with content area texts. I think the second finding is that relates to high quality discussion. And so, going back to that Durkin study, I described this example of, photosynthesis. That lots of studies reference this initiate, respond, and evaluate pattern, and that they weren't supporting teachers are maybe not doing quite enough yet to support reading comprehension discussions. However, I think another finding, and I think sometimes this study's been misinterpreted, is to say that we're not making progress. I think we are making progress, and so I would say that we're seeing increasing amounts of time on vocabulary, on engagement with text relative to studies that were conducted, 30 and 40 years ago. And so I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. We're seeing improvements in students and teachers' instruction related to reading comprehension, but we still have a little ways to go. And I think more opportunities for students to read text and then to engage in high quality discussion are important takeaways.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and then kind of building on that, Nina, what do you think are the biggest barriers preventing teachers from implementing research-backed practices in reading comprehension?
Yeah, so I think it's still an issue of awareness and access to the right information. So I was a teacher too. I'm not in the classroom now, but I talk to a lot of teachers and practitioners, and sort of a common theme, the most common thing that I hear is that their hands are tied. They already have a curriculum or a program that they're being forced to use, and they can't, even if they have access to this information about what works, they're told, they have to use this program that may or may not incorporate these evidence-based practices. And so I get that. I totally understand that. And so if you zoom out though a bit, that's still an issue of access if those school administrators, the school leaders, curriculum directors are not having the same access to the information that those teachers are, or if they have access and they're not interpreting it the same way. And so it's something our field is still struggling with. We're not getting the science out there as effectively, I think, as we should be, and we're still grappling with it. Now, that said, I think it is webinars and things like this where you get to hear from researchers who've actually conducted the research themselves, so there's no sort of game of telephone or lost in translation. And I think it's things like this where, you can, it helps. It's not a solution, but I definitely think it helps. So biggest barrier probably is still access to evidence-based practices and what works.
Okay, that's great. So Phil, you did a great job of highlighting some of the findings. Kit in your paper highlights the need for improved reading comprehension instruction. Can you talk about maybe 3 actionable strategies teachers can use to enhance reading comprehension instruction?
Yes. And I saw there was a question in the chat about connected text. And so what I mean by connected text is text that goes beyond a single sentence. So, it could be an informational text or it could be a narrative text, but it's any text that's combining multiple sentences that would allow for the sort of text processing and comprehension development that we really want students to acquire. In terms of actionable strategies for teachers, I think the practice guides have some really excellent recommendations. I think one critical part of supporting reading comprehension is supporting students' word and world knowledge. And so when we're thinking about word knowledge, we're thinking about vocabulary. And so we know that if you don't know the meaning of individual words within a passage, it's going to be very difficult to understand what you read. Similarly, if you don't have a lot of background knowledge on a topic, every text we read is written, almost every text is written where the writer is not exposing all of the information you need within the text to the reader. They're having to make some assumptions about what the reader knows. And so if you don't bring to bear very much background knowledge on a topic, it's very difficult to understand that text. So, in my life, I can do fine usually most of the time when I'm focused on reading research. But if I were to go down the hall and talk to someone about, their neuroscience work, I would have really poor reading comprehension. And it's because I don't have that background knowledge. I wouldn't know what those words meant. And so we see, based in research, that vocabulary and background knowledge are, really predictive of reading comprehension as students get older. And so how can we support word and world knowledge? I think academic language is something that has to be taught. We don't usually engage with academic language at the dinner table, on the schoolyard. And so providing students explicit vocabulary instruction can be helpful. And also teaching students to be word learners. So getting them conscious about words and interested in words. We can't probably teach them all the words they need to know. And so giving them strategies that they can use to become word conscious and building a culture around, learning words is really critical. And then I think also related to background knowledge, organizing our texts, the text that we're reading systematically to foster knowledge development, I think is really critical. So that would be one strategy is, I guess you could divide it into two, building word and world knowledge. I think another one that's really key is supporting students in engaging actively with complex texts. And so what does that look like? For some students, active engagement with text will likely occur pretty naturally. You give students an interesting text, you give them opportunities to talk to their peers and engage in questions. And if it feels relevant to them and challenging, then I think you're going to foster engagement for many students. Now, for some students, students that have reading difficulties, they might need some support. You can think about those students that, maybe you've taught that, they're reading through the passage and they misread a word, or it's clear they don't understand the word based on their expression, and they just keep reading, right? And so they're not very actively engaged. And so for those students, I think um, it can be helpful to support their metacognitive processes, to help them to monitor their comprehension and fix up their understandings when they have difficulties. And so there's specific supports that you can try. And we saw some reading comprehension strategy instruction in our study, but oftentimes that strategy instruction was really, what is the main idea of this passage? And the teachers are doing most of the work to, generate the strategies and just asking students to apply them. And what we didn't see as much in our review was helping students to understand the conditional knowledge of, like, when do I apply this strategy? Why would I apply it? And so, like, a main idea strategy might work in the context of an informational text, but in a narrative text, that's not usually how you understand it. Stories have, problems and solutions and, episodes, right? And so understanding those episodes is really important. Identifying the main idea is less important. And so it's helpful to generate students' active engagement with text through, particularly for struggling readers. And I want to make this point really clear. Like, I think the research, there's research in support of reading strategy instruction, but it should be a means to an end, and it should be dedicated to those students that have difficulties with text comprehension. And so I think those are, two strategies. And then the third is really just, I would say, engaging students in collaborative learning. Part of good teaching is stepping back and giving students opportunities to engage in the type of questions and engage with difficult texts. And we should certainly be supportive in those opportunities. But I think, if I'm the teacher and I'm at the front of the room and I'm reading the text aloud and I'm asking all the questions, then I'm doing most of the work, and I'm going to get better at reading, but that's not what our goal is, right? And so what kind of questions could I think of that are going to generate interest and engagement with students? And so, as opposed to asking, what is photosynthesis, I could ask students, in your own words, describe photosynthesis and the process to your neighbor. Now, what would life look like if photosynthesis didn't occur? Or how does photosynthesis relate to the food chain we learned about last week? And so I think engaging students in collaborative learning is maybe critical in this process.
Wow, that was awesome. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, that was great. And I love the examples, the specific examples that you gave, because educators can take that, and apply that tomorrow. Even if they might have a program that doesn't explicitly say that, those are easy questions that you can add to it. And so maybe a question for you, Sue. What's new at Metametrics in terms of reading comprehension instruction? Any new tools or anything we should be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. There's a couple things. Beginning in May, Metametrics assessment partners will have the option to report what we call strand level information along with a Lexile measure as part of their Lexile tests. So as you all know, the Lexile measure provides an indication of a student's overall ability in reading comprehension. The strand level reporting is now going to provide insight into a student's reading comprehension ability, but more at a more granular level. So specifically, descriptive information about how students are performing in areas that contribute to reading comprehension will be provided. The primary strands that we're going to be reporting on are foundational reading, and then we do have some substrands there for print concepts, phonological awareness, and phonics. Vocabulary, early reading comprehension, reading literature, and reading informational text. So we're really excited about this new offering. And like I said, it will be available for our partners who use our Lexile tests. We also recently launched, Nina, as you know, you can probably talk about this in more depth, but an early reading tool called Find a Decodable Book. Nina was instrumental in developing this offering. With this tool, you can search for decodable books by vowel sounds and then also see what percentage of vowel sounds is represented within each book. So the Find a Decodable Book is available on our Lexile Hub. So I think those are the two key tools. So, Phil, Nina, anything else to say? I think I'm looking at the time, we have a lot of good questions. It would be good to move into our Q&A section.
Yeah, that's fine. I
Great.
just wanted to comment real quick on the decodability analysis too. You might be wondering, how does that relate to comprehension instruction? Well, as Phil was saying too, if you don't understand the word, your comprehension, is going to suffer. And so for those struggling readers, there's this idea of the decoding threshold hypothesis, where below a certain point, it's not related to comprehension. You need to get to like a certain point. Not to say you should not be working on comprehension in those lower grades for struggling readers. You absolutely should. But it's really also important to get that word reading fluency up there to a critical point. So it does kind of relate. And yeah, we can move into Phil, did you have something to say? Sorry.
No, I was just going to echo that. I think that's important. The decodables, so decodable text or text where you're constraining the grapheme phoneme correspondences that are within words. And so if you're a first grade teacher, you might have a decodable text that has a lot of consonant, vowel, consonant words like cat. And the reason you constrain it is because you want to help students be successful in the early grades in practicing and moving from phonics, mapping letters on sounds, to reading a real text. And decodable allows that transition. And in the early grades, kinder first, you might see more decodables, but we also, as Nina said, of course, want to engage students in authentic text and develop their language and their vocabulary. And so it's not like you have to choose decodable or authentic. It's really you're fit for purpose. So if you're working on developing foundational reading, like word reading and the ability to read fluently, you would probably prioritize in those early grades some decodable text. And if your goal is language development and comprehension, then you might focus on authentic text. And so in authentic text, you're going to be working in your read alouds, right? And so it's a sort of both and situation where but I think the decodables can be a helpful resource in the early grades.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's move into the Q&A. Let's see. So I will just start at the top. And here's the first question. And Phil, Nina, I'm going to let you guys battle it out to see who answers. Is there a difference in the outcomes using nonfiction or fiction texts? I'm guessing that's for Phil.
I can start and then Nina, you could add to it.
Sure.
So what we see, I think, is in nonfiction text, you're going to often have higher levels of academic language, more complicated syntax. These are informational texts, oftentimes in social studies or in science, and those can be difficult to understand. And so sometimes on broad measures of reading, you'll see slightly lower scores on expository or informational or nonfiction text reading. We also do, though, on these broad measures, see sometimes students have difficulty with narrative text comprehension as well. That students have trouble inferring them, identifying the problems and the solutions in a story and understanding the goal-directed actions that the characters took to solve the problems. And that's because maybe there's still vocabulary in those books, right? And you still have to read the words. But we do see a little bit of difference in outcomes with informational texts, being slightly more difficult on average. I think the research is suggestive of that. And you're seeing a big push on developing knowledge and engaging students in informational text reading in the early grades. And I think that's really important. I don't think it means that we don't engage students in narrative text comprehension, right? We want that to be a part of the healthy diet of kids reading, we learn a lot from stories. It provides opportunities to learn about, yourself and the world. So again, we don't have to make these choices between them, but I think there's a big push on informational text reading, and it's because that is quite difficult for students.
Yeah, and I don't know if the person asking the question was referring specifically to your paper, but I don't, if they were, like the outcomes, were they different based on that? But I don't think you disaggregated it based on that. Am I correct? Yeah, you didn't. It was just whatever the studies had, and I don't think they went into that level of detail. But
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Okay, here's our next question. It's where can you find or where can someone find the practice guides?
oh, that's it. It should be if you Google, but I bet Phil's probably already finding the direct link right now.
Yeah, we can
So
put the
what
link
we're,
in the
yeah.
chat.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
awesome.
it's
Thank
a
you.
wonderful resource. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, but there's probably about 5 to 7 or 5 to 10 of these for different grade levels and topics. And it's aggregated the evidence that they found in the What Works Clearinghouse and gives really tangible, actionable advice for educators on how to implement this in the classroom.
Yeah, that's right. They cover reading, math, social emotional learning, behavioral interventions, lots of excellent practice guides. And there's a couple versions of them. If you really want to get in the weeds, you can read the full version of them. I like the educator practice guides, which are usually briefer and focused on supporting teachers and educators.
I actually didn't know that there were different versions. That's great. But the ones that I saw were very well written in terms of, the research jargon's kind of gone from it and it's just really key findings. So they're really well done.
Great. So I love this question. How do we get students interested in becoming word learners? That person asking the question said I was born with it.
Mhm.
That's a
Yeah,
great question. I mean,
I
there's,
think, I talked about a couple ideas a few minutes ago. I think modeling like a really curious and positive energy about words and an interest in words and like, oh, I learned this new word, I captured it using big words. As a teacher, those are things that I tried to values I tried to expose students to. I also think that there's some specific strategies you can use to help students. So it's not just, getting them to want to learn words, it's also giving them like tools, right? And so one way to support word learning is to help students see the word parts and the morphology within words. And so morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning in a word. And so when you learn morphemes, like, it could be a prefix or a suffix, like anti or pre or pro, when you learn those parts of the word, you can use that. When you come to a word you don't know, you can look within the word to try to find out some clues about the meaning of the word. You can also teach students to look around the word, right? And so um, you, you can help students to, when they get to an unknown word, they can often gain some information and sometimes infer the meaning of the word using the context. Now, this doesn't always work. Sometimes, you can't infer the meaning and, you might just have to call a friend. But oftentimes those tools can help students to sort of set them on a path to become better word learners. But Nina, you might have better ideas about this.
no, I was also going to bring up the morphology because I was at a triple SR conference and there was this fierce yelling debate between the back of the room and the front of the room. Researchers talking about, English being a morphophonemic, is that correct, Phil?
Mhm.
Language, like, and it's not truly alphabetic, and morphemes are what's going to get you that sort of meaning unit. And it's really fun once you start discovering these morphemes, you understand why words are spelled the way they are. So it's not just meaning, it's spelling, it's phonology that, the triangle model where it all kind of works together. And kids love that. They love looking for those clues. My own son is 8 now, and we've done games like that. And he's, asked me questions that I'm baffled by. And so we go and we look it up and we figure out the meaning. So it is fun. I think things like that, kids are naturally curious. So any sort of resources that kind of tie onto that. And I'm sure people in the audience could probably add stuff to the chat too that, I'm not aware of everything that's out there, but there's really fun word games now.
Well, there's also a comment that says, I encourage students to go on all field trips. I think this supports word knowledge. So I think that's an interesting addition.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, with the world knowledge too, that background knowledge. And, you're living those, especially rare words. Like my son, they just took a field trip to like the Navy Yard and there's a band playing. So they learn all these words associated with that they might not be exposed to in a different realm. So I think that's important too.
Yeah, great. Okay, next question is, I have heard comprehension instruction can be text-driven or strategy-driven. Is the research showing one better than the other? And can you speak to all of this?
I'm happy to go first or second, Nina.
I want you to go first because I want to hear I want to hear
Yeah,
you have thoughts on this, and I think you're going to say what I'm going to say, but it's definitely both. You need both it's using the right tool for the task. But Phil, you go first.
yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think, we talk about the science of reading as if it's sometimes one science, and it's many sciences that contribute to the science of reading. And we also sometimes talk about it as if it's the same for everyone, right? And we know that, effective teaching varies as a function of the student you're serving. And so, earlier I was talking about strategy instruction, and I was trying to make the point that, strategy instruction can be beneficial, particularly for students that are not actively engaged in text, but they should be a means to an end. The goal is not that students know how to ask and answer questions. The goal is that students, read and understand what they read and gain knowledge about the world and can use that knowledge sort of in life and in the workforce. And so, for me, the programs that I'm working on, so I did this study, the systematic review, but most of my work is actually intervention research. And mostly I work on developing reading programs. And the ones that I'm working on related to reading comprehension, I'm usually focused on a text-driven approach in which we're trying to organize units around meaningful themes and systematically develop knowledge. So in the context of social studies, I've been working with colleagues to develop and enhance lessons that are focused on world history. And those lessons are not around like strategies, right? They're around world history topics. But, when students have difficulty, we can think about strategies that can provide a scaffold for those students. And so I think, the research shows that, I think both approaches, when well done, are leading to improved outcomes. I don't think we have to choose one or the other. I think if you were going to choose, you might choose a more text knowledge-based approach, and then you would interweave the strategies for students when they're having difficulties.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on to that, because that was a great explanation, is that you want to be intentional in the text that you're selecting. If you're doing a strategy, if you're trying to teach a certain strategy, you want to make sure there's great examples of it. It shouldn't be, I'm teaching this reading comprehension strategy this week and just not even thinking about the text that you're using to supplement that. And I know that I'm going to forget the name of the program, but Dr. Kay Wijikumar, Phil, do you know her work with
Mhm.
on text as well and using the text structure? So text structure, background knowledge, and strategy, comprehension strategies should all be thought of when you're using a specific text to teach.
Yeah, no, that's really key. It's not, I was talking about maybe the content area and the student, but I think the specific text is also, a part of this. And so you got to think about these factors when you're deciding the sort of instructional approach you're going to take on.
Yeah, definitely.
Great information. The next question is, I am surprised metacognition has not been mentioned. I did my master's thesis on it, and my students in classrooms in my tutoring practice are not savvy in visualizing. And then in parens, especially in a world where kids get so much info from visuals, so they are not forming images. Predicting, questioning, and inferring. They need instruction. So I think the basic question is around metacognition.
I'm not sure I understood the last part of the predicting that part, but I do. So I don't know the research off the top of my head, but there was a conference abstract last SSR where a woman had an assessment of imager, like how, if you're a high imager, you could quickly and easily visualize things in your head from text, and if you were low. So I think the field's moving towards this idea of trying to see, can we increase if you're a low imager, can we increase that and maybe you comprehend better or not? So I think it's early stages as that's where I'm aware of it right now. I'm not sure if there's other stuff out there, but I do think, I thought they were going to go to executive function and start asking about progress monitoring and all of that, which is a whole nother set of research. But Phil, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think metacognition is really related to the reading strategy work. And so, we know that there are cognitive processes involved in reading, and an important one is the metacognitive processes. And those, you're thinking about your thinking. And so, there are students who have difficulty, establishing their engagement with text and maintaining it over time, right? And so when you work on metacognition, you're helping students to evaluate their understanding and fix up misunderstandings as they arise. And so I think that's really critical. And it's very difficult to draw inferences from text and to fill gaps in information and to form these connections or build these mental models if you are not maintaining attention, or you don't have these metacognitive processes in place. And so for those students, those are the ones who it can be helpful to teach them a strategy such as asking and answering questions as they read. And so if you have a student who's reading and not comprehending what they read and just continuing to read along, right? We talked about that example earlier. That's the type of student that might be helpful to say, okay, as you're reading, I want you to ask and answer 2 questions. And that sort of gives them a purpose for maintaining engagement, and it also gives them a metacognitive process, right? And that's kind of something that we probably all do. Is like there's times where we drift our attention, and then we have to go back and fix it up. But some students might need some supports with that. So I think it's an important part of the conversation is metacognition. I think also, the knowledge also really matters, right? So you could be very engaged and have these cognitive processes at play, but if you don't know what the words mean or you don't have the background knowledge, it's still very difficult to build that mental model.
Yeah, that's an excellent point about the working memory capacity of, and how background knowledge ties into that. If you know a certain area if you have certain background knowledge in a certain area, you're going to be freed up to start thinking about that. I like the discussion about progress monitoring too, but I guess there's nothing specifically if her question was on visualizing. I'm not sure about new research on that, but.
Yeah, I think there's research to support reading comprehension strategy broadly, particularly when it's done well and it's providing students that conditional knowledge that we talked about earlier, where you help you fade the supports, and so they're in charge of identifying when and how to use these practices. The specific strategies, I think. There's not very strong research to suggest, in my view, which specific reading comprehension strategies have the most efficacy. The one that maybe has the most is asking and answering questions. I think in general, though, these strategies again are a means to an end. So we want to fade these supports. And so, we don't want to have to ask students to visualize or help them build images forever, right? We want to provide that for some period of time and then fade the supports.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you everyone for the great questions, and thank you, Phil and Nina, for your answers. We are just about at time, and so I want to be cognizant of that. There are still about, looks like 18 to 20 more questions, and I want to assure everybody that while we don't have time to go through them all right now, we will get back to you, and we will follow up and provide responses to all of the questions. So great audience, great questions. Thank you so much. Before we wrap up for the day, I want to let's talk about the winner of the trivia, the pop quiz. And I apologize in advance if I don't say your name correctly, but Kaylee Ryherd has won a $100 gift certificate to Gold Belly. And so you can pick the pie of your choice for Pie Day. So congratulations, you got all of the answers correct. That is just awesome. And I do want to point out that if you look at number 4, which of the following literacy skills can educators and parents support using the Lexile and Quantile Hub? Just want to remind everybody that decoding, vocabulary acquisition, reading comprehension, those are all tools that are free to educators and partner states on our hub. So please take advantage of that. So thank you to our fabulous panelists for presenting research and talking through it and making it very understandable. And thank you all for attending the webinar today. So I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Nina.
Bye.